Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome again to another episode of the Path Builders podcast series, Path Breaker. These are short discussions with industry experts who talk about specific opportunities, their journey in the impact sector, providing practical insights on what their day looks like and the skills required for the role. Today's speaker is a close friend and a former colleague, Jayanth Kashyap. Hello, Jayanth. Welcome to the series. And maybe you can start off by telling us a little bit about who you are and what you're currently doing and which organization do you work for.
Hi, CK. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me to the Path Builder series. Quite interesting in terms of what you're doing here. I think really appreciate the objective. I think it's useful to have someone like you putting out this content for the younger audience who are essentially at the point where they're taking a decision if they want to study further or work further or do something more meaningful. So yeah, happy to be here. But just to introduce myself, my name is Jayanth Kashyap. I'm currently an investment advisor at Fount, based in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. My own background, if I can put briefly, is I've worked within the impact space, specifically within impact investing for the last 10 years. But even prior to that, I had worked for a startup called Venture Intelligence, where I was essentially leading sell-side PEVC research. So you could essentially say that that was my entry point into the world of investments and startups as such. I think.
Oh, great. No, good to hear. And how, what was the trigger or initial step towards interest into the impact investing space? What were your early part of your career? What did you study initially, and then how did you get involved in the impact investing space?
So I took a very non-traditional path, even for we're talking about 2008, 2009. This is right after the financial crisis. I was happily, studying a bachelor's of business administration, and this was in Chennai in Vivekananda College. So you could say I was partly happy-go-lucky, but partly I also knew at some point I also did want to do my MBA. But I think typically, especially people who are in the commerce field, they tend to opt for the BCom, which is traditionally the path that graduates take, and then they do either a professional degree like a chartered accountant, cost like CWA, or a company secretary. So you could say that even 10, 15 years ago, options were quite limited, or rather people were opting for the regular career paths, and nothing against them. It's just that I think at that point we didn't have like a path breaker or a path builder series like what you're trying to do. So a lot of figuring out in terms of next steps in the career or in your profession, rested completely on you. So I think it was interesting because right after graduating in 2009, I had a kind of a fork in my life at that point. I had an offer from a large MNC, but it had to do more with data crunching and just analyzing data, which was okay, not too bad, but not particularly exciting for me. But the role with venture intelligence itself was quite interesting because the startup culture, even though it is prevalent in Chennai, I wouldn't say it was a typical career path that undergrads chose at that point. So I think even from a risk-taking perspective, it was considered a bold step, maybe in hindsight, for a lot of youngsters right now who are readily moving into startups. They might not probably relate to what I'm saying, but imagine 2008, 2009, when nobody is hiring, and when even if firms were making offers, you would tend to go towards the one that are a bit more stable. So for someone to choose a startup role, which is, even though it is probably relatively well known in their own space, but probably not a big name company as it were, I think it was probably a bold move at that point. But I would say it was the 2 years that I spent at the company were quite formative because we were a small team, less than 10 people. So it is pretty multifunctional. So I was doing research, I was doing business development, I was doing sales, doing product demos of our databases. The company itself was essentially tracking the entire private equity and venture capital ecosystem in India and cross-border M&A transactions. So I think the advantage that I had at that point was just getting this 20,000 or 30,000 feet view of the markets in India. And imagine VCs like Sequoia and Ps like KKR making these investments across private and public companies. So just the insight into how money was moving into markets, valuations, entrepreneurs, sectors. So that is quite eye-opening for me, personally, I would say. And I guess the move into impact investing was not something that happened overnight, because this was around the time when impact investing hadn't even been coined yet. If I remember correctly, impact investing as a term was coined by the Rockefeller Foundation only a little later. But the idea of using capital to support companies which are solving or addressing particular environmental or societal challenges seemed quite interesting. But it wasn't a career choice that I was immediately looking at. So it is something that I was tracking, but wasn't really sure in terms of what it meant or what really the purpose was. But I think the second kind of fork in the road for me was after 2 years working at venture intelligence, I really wanted to move into venture capital because I'm really enamored by the idea of investing in companies, seeing them grow, working with entrepreneurs. As you can imagine, it's quite interesting and exciting for someone at that age to move into that space. It is considered still quite glamorous to be in VC, but I was really keen on speaking to entrepreneurs or understanding how they were growing their businesses. So that was the path that I wanted to take. So the second fork in the road for me was, should I look at impact? Should I look at VC, or should I, kind of go abroad or, for my master's, or essentially study somewhere in India? And I would presume for most of the people listening to this podcast, I would assume that they are somewhere in that journey to where they're trying to figure out if they want to spend money and time studying further just immediately after completing their undergrad, or if they want to continue working where they are, or try something new entirely. But I think that once again, this wasn't an overnight decision. So another decision that I took was to just take off from work. I wasn't working full time for almost a year, but what I did during that time was prepare myself for the role in impact investments or in venture capital. So a couple of things that I did was Coursera was just coming up. The idea of massive online open courses was picking up and was quite popular around that time. So I signed up for financial modeling courses. What I would do is every week I would spend at least 30 minutes to an hour every day just understanding the basics of financial modeling. Even though I knew about valuations and cap tables and how investments work, I think it's quite different when you have to translate business model into numbers. So that is something that I was doing. And I was also doing an executive diploma in financial management at an institution in Chennai. It's called the Loyola Institute of Business Administration. And this was in anticipation of another variable, as you might be aware, especially if you have to do a master's in the US. And if you're a commerce student, the expectation is for you to have at least 16 years of full-time education. So I was doing that also, just to have that requirement under the belt, as learning financial modeling, and parallel at the same time, the move into impact itself. What I wanted to do was I wanted to see if I was cut out for impact. If I could really commit myself to the space. So at that point, a close friend of mine from college, he had found out this organization called Teach for India, which is similar to Teach for America. So there were a few fellows in Chennai who were working in government schools, and he asked me, hey, shall we go and volunteer here, because it seems really interesting in terms of what they're doing. And since you're considering the move into impact, maybe this is a good opportunity for you to really see, if this is something that you want to do. So the next 7 months, I was essentially working as a volunteer to a TFI fellow at a government school, where I was essentially working with a bunch of third and fourth grade students. I was teaching them math and English. And I would say the experience itself was super interesting, because I think most of the students who come to or who are part of these classes, not all of them, but some of them do come from very difficult backgrounds. So it's evident in terms of how they behave in class. They're not very, let's say, compliant in terms of what the fellows ask them to do. So I was working with these so-called, I wouldn't use difficult students, just children who need a bit more attention. So that was quite enjoyable. Like if I can share one example, I was asked to teach vowels and consonants, and even for me, it had been a while since even for me to remember in terms of how that is taught. So I relied on YouTube videos like the alphabet song, and you could immediately see that the children were hooked. The learning seemed more quicker. They were more attentive. When there's some kind of digital content supported by someone who's physically there. And over the course of the next few weeks, I built like a really good relationship with them. They felt that they could trust me, and I also equally enjoyed working with them. But I think the outcome of all of this was that I quickly realized that I really enjoyed helping others. Now, this wasn't a revelation. As an individual, I've always been someone who's liked working together with others, even during school or during college. But just professionally, to use, if you think about impact investing as a field, you really need to commit. So the passion and the intention has to come out. So you can't move into it just for the sake of it. So that I would say that particular hypothesis of mine was validated. And the other thing also was that I decided that I wanted to be on the commercial side of impact investment and not on the closer to not-for-profits or the development side, because that deals with grants. So I would say that fork in the road, or essentially giving myself that time, that 1 year, or just trying to understand if this is something that I wanted to do, that was really helpful. So I guess the takeaway there is, if you're at a point where you're taking a big decision in life, it doesn't hurt to take some time off to reflect, to try some new things, and to really build your profile towards a role where you already have like hundreds of other more qualified candidates. Because according to me, the difference between someone who is qualified and someone who's motivated is that the motivated candidate is ready, prepared, and more hungry for the role than someone who just has the qualifications and not the drive. So I think that really makes a difference.
Quite insightful. No, it's been quite interesting. Picking up a thread that you said, I think was trying to decide on an MBA. So now that you've had a couple of sort of folks in the road that helped you get into the impact investing, and then and one of the things you mentioned is at some point you were also wanting to do a master's or an MBA. And what I'm curious to know is, once you got into impact investing and the kind of work that you were doing, maybe just a couple of lines on that, but then what made you choose an MBA as opposed to a different kind of master's? And what were your thought process in deciding whether to do an MBA within India as opposed to internationally? Over to you.
No, absolutely. I think when I mentioned earlier about choosing between a master's and working further, I should admit that even though I didn't probably have a mentor, I did rely on the guidance of many um, people who had reached out through LinkedIn at that point. So another plug that I have is to use platforms like LinkedIn to reach out to senior folks who are probably in the trajectory that you think that you want yourself to be in. So, and they're quite open to sharing their experiences and providing some insights as well. So I would say that while the decision to move into impact investing was mine, but I would say a lot of that was also defined by the lessons learned, or even some of the failures that other people had. In hindsight, that they would have done differently. So I did have the benefit of that as well. So yeah, I think it became pretty clear to me that while pursuing higher education just 2 years after undergrad um, is probably okay, and it works for in many situations. Personally, in my situation, I felt that working a bit more, a couple of years more, gaining more experience within the sector that I wanted to be in, and then more into the MBA would bring more value to the class that I was going to join, and also just improve my perspective about the kind of markets that I wanted to operate in. The decision to do the MBA itself, like I said, like uh, most, I would say, people of my age back then, when you're 17 or 18, I think the MBA is kind of the holy grail of masters. So I have no shame in admitting that there was a certain glamour, or I don't know if that's the right word, but there was a certain appeal to it. It's probably a better way to put it. But then as I kept working, I think what crystallized out of that is really in terms of why I wanted to do the MBA. So by the time I was ready to kind of apply for my master's, and I missed mentioning that I did eventually break into impact investing after the 1 year of preparation. So I joined Element as their first associate for their impact fund, which was investing in India. There are a lot of other things which I did there over the next 3 years between 2013 and 2016. But within the impact space, those were formative years, just working on investments, working with entrepreneurs, and then parallelly also developing expertise on investment advisory as well. But to answer your question, the decision to do the MBA almost seemed natural by the time I had spent close to 5 years working. And when I say it felt natural, I meant that especially within impact investing, as you know, there is a lot of domestic and foreign capital. You have multiple stakeholders within the impact investment space. These could be foundations, these could be venture capital funds, these could be governments, these could be development finance institutions, or multilateral banks. So there are different kinds of, let's say, institutions at play who are managing capital, mobilizing capital, and then of course on the other side you have companies and not-for-profits and organizations who are utilizing that capital, to kind of develop the markets that they operate in. So I think the professional reasons to do the MBA crystallized because I was quite keen to understand in terms of how capital was being allocated across markets. Having already worked for an impact fund, for an equity impact fund, in the capacity of a GP, I was really keen to understand in terms of how these larger institutions who manage billions and billions of dollars, how do they decide where to put the money in? How do they decide which sectors to put the capital in? So for me, moving into the international space seemed very important. And that's why I would say the move into the MBA, and particularly I would say fortunate to have been admitted into the Side Business School at the University of Oxford. So the university itself is very supportive and encouraging people who are working or would like to work in the impact space. So, and especially being in the UK, which sits at the heart of, let's say, in this side of the world, in terms of allocations within the impact investment space, was quite helpful, just to speak to and meet with different professionals who are either directly investing in companies or investing in other funds, which you call as fund of funds approach, as it were, and also speaking to people who are advising, these stakeholders that I mentioned on different aspects in terms of strategy, in terms of 5-year investment strategies or sectoral investment strategies, or identifying, emerging technologies. Because I think during my time in the UK, you heard terms like technology for good, or blockchain for good. So there are a lot of these for good, kind of prefixes and suffixes that are coming up. So these markets are slightly ahead in terms of, let's say, the Asian markets in terms of the thought process in terms of capital allocations. But not to say that in a country like India, where we are, that the thinking and the strategy wasn't there. It's just that internationally, these firms are looking at different markets, so the approach was quite different. So I would say that was a primary motivation as to why I looked outside rather than within India. But for if anyone is in that decision in life, should they move outside of the country for their master's, specifically their MBA, or if they should do within the country, I would say it purely depends on what you want and where you ultimately want to work in. So if your intention is to work in India, and it is already a very vibrant, fast-growing market with many talented and incredibly networked individuals, if this is where you want to be and work in, and then doing an MBA within India is, of course, the most logical thing to do, even from a financial perspective, because I think that is, of course, also a very big consideration. Maybe the discussion on how I finance my MBA is a different conversation altogether, which is another story as well. But I would say, that would be something that I would want to share. If someone is considering whether they should do their MBA in India versus abroad, because there are very specific advantages and, let's say, demerits as to doing in each region. So if I were to speak for why, for me particularly, it's working internationally, I would say it's the cultural exposure. I think there are different, let's say, work cultures, and we have different cultures back home in India. So I'm from Chennai. The culture in Tamil Nadu, or even in Chennai, let me not even say Tamil Nadu, it's so different between Chennai and, let's say, a city like Coimbatore. So imagine that amplified 100 times when you move outside of the country to somewhere like the UK, or where I am right now in the Netherlands. So the way people approach problems, or let's say, or the way they come up with solutions, particularly within the impact investing space, is so different. So just being exposed to that kind of environment, I would say, has been quite beneficial for me, particularly. And the other reasons that I mentioned in terms of understanding broader market movements, or being closer to where capital is flowing from. So yeah, I think that's what I would say.